The human fleet surrounded Vethrak Prime like a crown of steel and fire. Hundreds of warships holding position in orbital space while billions of Vethrak waited below for the destruction they were certain would come. Admiral Seong stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable and looked down at the world that had spawned the species responsible for New Bizen. It was beautiful in the way that all living worlds were beautiful. Blue oceans and green continents and swirling clouds that spoke of the life teeming beneath them. Somewhere on that surface, Vethrak children were looking up at the sky and wondering if today would be their last day alive. Her fleet had the power to end them, and they knew it, and the galaxy knew it. And there was a part of her that wanted nothing more than to give the order and watch that world burn away. New Bizen had burned. She thought about the families who would never be whole again, the dreams that had been destroyed, the 2.3 million human beings whose only crime had been building homes too close to space, claimed by predators who saw them as beneath consideration. The anger was still there, burning like a star in her chest, and it would never fully fade no matter how many years passed. But Seong had not spent 40 years in military service without learning the difference between what she wanted and what was right. She opened a channel to her fleet. All ships, hold position, she ordered, and she heard the confusion and the acknowledgments that came back. Her captains had expected an attack order, had prepared themselves for the final battle that would end the Vethrak forever. Instead, she turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to Vethrak Prime, all frequencies, she said. I want every being on that world to hear what I am about to say. The officer complied. And Seong stepped forward to address the planet below. People of Vethrak Prime. This is Admiral Seong of the United Earth Fleet. She paused, letting her words sink in across a world waiting for death. 1 year ago, your government attacked the human colony of New Bizen without warning or provocation, killing 2.3 million civilians. And you broadcast that massacre across the galaxy as a warning to species you consider beneath you. Her voice was steady and calm, carrying across the void with perfect clarity. We came here for justice, and we have the power to take justice in the form of your extinction. And there is not a single being in this galaxy who would blame us for doing so. On the surface below, Vethrak families held each other and waited for the end. But we are not you. The words hung in the air, and Seong felt the weight of what she was about to do settle onto her shoulders. We did not fight this war to become the monsters you tried to make us. And we will not murder billions of civilians to avenge the murder of millions. She took a breath and continued. Instead, we demand the following: unconditional surrender of all Vethrak military forces, war crimes tribunals for all individuals responsible for the New Bizen massacre, permanent restrictions on Vethrak military capability, and reparations to the families of those who died. The terms were harsh, the kind of demands that would have seemed impossible for any species to accept. You have 1 standard hour to respond. She terminated the transmission and turned to find Ambassador Park standing behind her, his face unreadable. You know there will be those who call you weak for this, he said quietly. Who will say you should have finished them when you had the chance? Seong nodded, her eyes still fixed on the world below. I know, and I do not care, because I did not lead 100,000 soldiers to their deaths so that we could become the next empire of monsters. She turned to face him fully. We showed the galaxy what happens when you harm our people. And now we will show them that our justice has limits, that we are capable of mercy even when mercy is not deserved. Park was silent for a long moment, and then he smiled. That is exactly the message humanity needs to send. The Vethrak response came in 43 minutes. Acceptance of all terms delivered in a voice that trembled with shock and something that might have been gratitude. The war was over in the months that followed. The galaxy watched as humanity proved that their mercy was as genuine as their fury had been. Sergeant Lim helped establish reconstruction programs on former Vethrak worlds, working alongside former enemies to rebuild what the war had destroyed. Dr. Kang locked away her weapons research and returned to studying peaceful energy applications, though the files remained accessible in case they were ever needed again. Trade Minister Wang negotiated trade agreements that brought prosperity to human space while ensuring that former Vethrak territories were integrated. Rather than exploited, Ambassador Park became the most influential voice in galactic politics, a figure whose words carried the weight of a species that had proven itself capable of both terrible destruction and remarkable restraint. The Galactic Concord Assembly granted humanity full membership with a unanimous vote, and elder races who had dismissed them as primitive curiosities now treated human representatives with deep respect and underlying caution. Chronicler Zeth Valamir completed their record of the human Vethrak War, a document that would be studied by species across the galaxy for millennia to come. Their final entry included a classification that had been empty for longer than most civilizations had existed: humanity, apex threat, dormant. They added a notation that subsequent chroniclers would quote for generations. They are capable of great compassion and terrible destruction, and the deciding factor is how they are treated. So the galaxy would be wise to treat them well. Years passed, and new species rose to join the galactic community, and each of them learned the same stories about the humans who had humbled an empire and then chosen not to destroy it. A young species considering violence against a human trade vessel was stopped by their elders, who spoke a phrase that had become galactic wisdom: "Do not wake the humans on Earth." Children grew up learning about the new Bizan War in their history classes, about the price of peace and the weight of power and the responsibility that came with being strong. They learned about Admiral Seong, who had won an unwinnable war and then chosen mercy over vengeance. They learned about Ambassador Park, whose words had declared war and whose diplomacy had built a lasting peace. They learned about all the soldiers and scientists and workers who had transformed humanity into a weapon and then chosen to lay that weapon down. And somewhere in the vast archives of the Oralith Collective, Chronicler Zeth Valamir added one final observation to their record of the human species. We spent millions of years believing that power came from conquest, and that strength meant the ability to destroy. But humanity has taught us something we had forgotten. The crystalline being paused, their silicon fingers hovering over the recording interface. True strength is not the ability to destroy your enemies, but the wisdom to know when destruction is not the answer. They completed their entry and closed the file, and across the galaxy, humanity continued to build and explore and grow. A species that had learned the terrible cost of war and chosen, despite everything, to be better than those who had tried to break them. The universe had learned to fear human anger, and now it was learning something far more important. It was learning to trust human mercy. 6 months after the declaration of war, the Vethrak Dominion experienced something that had not occurred in 3,000 years of galactic history. They were losing human fleets pushed deep into Vethrak territory with a relentless momentum that defied everything the Dominion's military analysts had predicted. Each system they took became a staging ground for the next advance. Supply lines stretching back to human space with an efficiency that spoke of preparation that should have been impossible in such a short time. Admiral Seong directed the campaign from the Bridge of the Indomitable, her hair now streaked with gray that had not been there when the war began, her eyes carrying the weight of every life lost under her command. She had stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night, spending her remaining waking time studying intelligence reports and planning operations and writing personal letters to the families of fallen soldiers. The burden was crushing, And she carried it anyway, because that was what humanity needed from her. Ambassador Park worked tirelessly to keep neutral powers from intervening on the Vethrak's behalf, meeting with representatives from species who had watched humanity's transformation with growing concern. The elder races were beginning to understand that the galaxy they had known was changing, that a new power was rising from the ashes of New Bizin, and they were not sure whether to be relieved or terrified. The Concord Assembly debated endlessly about what to do, some representatives calling for intervention to stop the bloodshed, while others argued that humanity had every right to seek justice for the massacre of their people. In the end, they did nothing, because no species wanted to risk drawing human attention toward themselves. Sergeant Lim led ground operations on occupied Vethrak worlds, and what he found there complicated the simple narrative of vengeance that had driven him to re-enlist. The Vethrak civilians were not the monsters he had expected. They were farmers and merchants and teachers, families who had never wanted war, children who cried when soldiers approached their homes. Lim remembered New Bizin and the burning cities and the broadcasts of Vethrak soldiers laughing as they killed, and he felt the rage that had sustained him for 6 months, warring with something older and more fundamental. He gave orders that confused his troops and infuriated some of his superiors. Vethrak civilians were to be treated humanely, their property respected, their lives protected unless they took up arms against human forces. The same hands that had torn through Vethrak soldiers on the command cruiser now helped rebuild damaged infrastructure and distributed food to hungry families. His soldiers grumbled that he had gone soft, but Lim knew something they did not yet understand. Victory was not just about destroying your enemy, but about becoming something worth fighting for. Human intelligence operations, meanwhile, worked to turn the Vethrak's ancient alliance network against them. The Dominion had conquered and absorbed dozens of species over millennia, and those subject races had never forgotten their lost freedom. Agents made contact with resistance movements on 100 worlds, promising liberation in exchange for cooperation. And one by one, the foundations of Vethrak power began to crumble. Client species who had served the Dominion for generations suddenly remembered old grudges and began sabotaging military installation. Supply lines that had operated smoothly for centuries became unreliable as workers slowed. Production and transportation networks experienced mysterious delays. The Vethrak High Command found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts, their carefully maintained order collapsing like a structure whose supports had been quietly removed. Chronicler Zeth Valamir continued their documentation, interviewing captured Vethrak officers in prisoner of war camps that were, against all expectation, models of humane treatment. The prisoners received adequate food and medical care and were protected from the kind of brutality that Vethrak had inflicted on countless conquered peoples. One captured commander, a seasoned veteran named Thrik Salith, spoke to the chronicler with something in his voice that Zeth Valamir had never heard from a Vethrak before. "They do not stop," Thrik Salith said, his scales dull with the weight of defeat. "We destroyed their colony, killed millions of their people, and we expected them to break as other species have broken when we showed them the cost of resistance." He looked at the chronicler with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "Instead, they grew stronger, and they keep coming, and they do not tire, and they do not negotiate, and they do not forgive." The veteran's claws scraped against the floor of his cell. "We do not know how to fight an enemy that is not afraid to die." The Vethrak High Command, in their desperation, approved a plan that would have been unthinkable before the war. They would deploy a planet killer weapon against the human colony world of New Melbourne, a device capable of cracking a planet's crust and rendering it uninhabitable for millennia. The weapon had been developed centuries ago as a last resort against an enemy that could not be defeated conventionally. And it had never been used, because no enemy had ever pushed the Dominion so far. But humanity had pushed them beyond all limits. And the High Command believed that the threat of extinction would finally break human resolve. They were wrong. Human intelligence had infiltrated Vethrak communications networks months ago. And Admiral Seong received word of the Planet Killer deployment before it even left Vethrak space. She dispatched a special operations team led by soldiers who had been selected for this kind of mission. Volunteers who understood that they might not come back. They intercepted the Planet Killer in the Nephilim system and destroyed it along with its escort fleet in an operation that cost 200 human lives. The attempted genocide only hardened human resolve, transforming what had been a war of justice into something closer to a crusade. Trade Minister Wang reported that civilian volunteers for military service had increased by 40% since news of the Planet Killer spread. Scientists who have been reluctant to work on weapons research now threw themselves into the effort with grim determination. Even species who had been neutral began quietly providing intelligence and supplies to human forces, recognizing that the Vethrak had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The human fleet reached the outskirts of Vethrak space 2 months later, their advance unstoppable despite everything the Dominion threw against them. Admiral Seong stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display showing the path to Vethrak Prime, the homeworld of the species that had dominated this region of the galaxy for 10,000 years. Admiral, her communications officer said, voice tight with barely contained emotion. We are receiving a transmission from the Vethrak High Command. Seong nodded, and the main screen flickered to show a chamber filled with the highest authorities of the Dominion. Aged Vethrak, whose scales had faded with centuries of rule. We request negotiations, the eldest of them said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized Vethrak communications throughout the war. We are prepared to discuss terms for ending this conflict. Admiral Seong looked at the faces of her bridge crew, seeing the exhaustion and the grief and the anger that had sustained them through months of fighting. She thought about Bizin and the friends she had lost and the price humanity had paid for this moment. No, she said simply, the Vethrak delegation stared in disbelief. You must understand, the elder tried again. We are offering. I understand perfectly, Seong interrupted, her voice cold and steady. You are offering negotiations because you are losing, and you hope to preserve what remains of your power through diplomacy now that military force has failed. She leaned forward, and something in her eyes made even the ancient Vethrak leaders shrink back. Humanity did not ask for this war, and we did not want this war, but you gave us no choice. And now you will see it through to the end. She terminated the connection and turned to her navigation officer. Set course for Vethrak Prime, she ordered. The fleet advances at dawn. The bridge crew responded with quiet efficiency, and across the human fleet, soldiers and sailors prepared for what they all knew would be the final battle. They had come so far and lost so much. And now, at last, they would finish what the Vethrak had started. The Battle of Kepler 442 began with silence. The vast emptiness of space swallowing the thunder of engines and the hum of charging weapons as two fleets closed the distance. Between them, the Vethrak commander, a veteran named Sarthak Ventress, had fought in more battles than most species experienced in their entire histories. And he approached this engagement with the confidence of a predator facing prey that had somehow acquired claws. His 300 warships moved in the traditional Dominion formation. Heavy cruisers at the center, protected by screening destroyers. Carriers holding back to deploy fighters once the enemy lines were engaged. It was a formation that had broken a dozen species across 10,000 years. And Sarthak Ventress saw no reason to change. What had always worked, Admiral Seong watched the approaching fleet through her tactical display, and felt a grim smile touch her lips. The Vethrak were fighting the way they had always fought, using tactics developed in ancient wars against species that no longer existed, and they expected humanity to respond in kind. Instead, as the two fleets entered maximum weapons range, the human formation did something the Vethrak had never seen. It scattered ships that had been moving in precise formation suddenly broke apart like a school of fish avoiding a predator, spreading across three-dimensional space in patterns that seemed random but were anything but the Vethrak targeting systems, designed to track formations and predict movement based on established tactical doctrine, struggled to lock onto vessels that refused to behave according to any doctrine at all. Sarthuk Ventress roared orders to his fleet, demanding they adapt to the human chaos. But before his ships could respond, the first wave of human missiles struck. Dr. Kang's weapons had been designed specifically for this moment. Warheads carrying payloads that destabilized Vethrak shields by exploiting frequencies the Dominion had never thought to protect against. The shields did not fail completely, but they flickered and weakened at precisely the moments when human kinetic rounds arrived to punch through the gaps. 3 Vethrak destroyers died in the first exchange, their hulls splitting open like fruit crushed by invisible hands, and for the first time in living memory, the Dominion fleet felt the unfamiliar sensation of surprise. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. Though no species would ever quite manage to replicate human tactics, Admiral Seong had spent weeks studying ancient Earth naval battles, reading accounts of commanders who had faced superior forces and somehow emerged victorious through creativity and sacrifice. She employed tactics from Trafalgar and Midway and Salamis, strategies developed on the oceans of a single world that translated somehow into the vast emptiness between stars. Her ships did not fight as a unified force, but as hundreds of individual predators, each captain empowered to make decisions based on their own assessment of the battlefield. Vethrak commanders, trained to follow orders and maintain formation, found themselves facing enemies who seemed to read their minds, who anticipated their movements and struck where they least expected. When a human cruiser was damaged beyond combat capability, it did not retreat. Instead, Captain Yong-Soo Beek of the destroyer Fury aimed his crippled vessel directly at the nearest Vethrak carrier and accelerated to maximum speed. The Vethrak crew had never seen an enemy ship deliberately sacrifice itself, had never imagined that any species would consider such a thing, and their confusion lasted just long enough for the Fury to breach their hull. The explosion took both ships, and across the human fleet, other damaged vessels began doing the same. Concorde observation drones recorded everything, broadcasting the battle to species across the galaxy who had tuned in expecting to watch humanity's swift defeat. Instead, they witnessed something that made ancient races who had not known fear for millennia begin to feel it stirring in their hearts. Human Marines boarded Vethrak vessels, despite casualty rates that would have made any other species break and flee. Soldiers in powered armor breached enemy hulls and fought hand-to-hand against enemies twice their size, dying by the dozens, but never stopping, never retreating, never surrendering. Pilots whose ships were destroyed ejected into space and continued fighting with handheld weapons, knowing they would run out of oxygen long before rescue arrived, but refusing to stop until their hearts gave out. Sergeant Lim led a boarding action against the Vethrak command cruiser, his squad of 50 Marines cutting through enemy forces with a ferocity that left the reptilian soldiers hesitating. They had never faced an enemy that did not break, had never fought beings who seemed to grow stronger as their numbers diminished, who screamed battle cries in a language the Vethrak could not understand but somehow feared anyway. Lim lost 37 of his 50 Marines taking the cruiser's bridge, and when he finally stood over the body of the ship's captain, His armor was damaged, and his ammunition was exhausted, and his left arm hung useless at his side. But he was smiling. Because the mission was complete, chronicler Zeth Valamir watched the battle unfold from a safe distance. Their crystalline body pulsing with colors that other Orlith would have recognized as distress. They had documented warfare for millions of years, had recorded the strategies and tactics of 1,000 species, and they had never seen anything like this. This was not warfare as the galaxy understood it. This was something older and more primal, something that had been burned into human genetics during millions of years of survival on a world that tried to kill them every single day. The Vethrak fought to win. The humans fought as if losing was not a concept they understood, as if death was simply a price they were willing to pay, rather than an outcome to be avoided after 6 hours of combat. Sarthok Ventress ordered his remaining ships to retreat. He had entered the system with 300 warships and the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. He fled with less than 80, leaving behind the burning wreckage of vessels that had seemed invincible, and the bodies of soldiers who had been killed by enemies, who should have been easy prey. Admiral Sion watched the Vethrak fleet run and felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion and grief for the ship she had lost and the people who would never come home. She opened a channel to her remaining forces. "All ships, pursue," she ordered, and her voice carried the weight of humanity's answer to New Bizayn. They would not stop. They would not negotiate. They would keep coming until the Vethrak Dominion understood exactly what kind of enemy they had created across the galaxy. Species who had watched the broadcast sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. The humans had not just won. They had revealed something about themselves that changed everything, something that made even the most ancient and powerful civilizations begin to reconsider their assumptions about the young species from that harsh little world. Chronicler Zeth Valamir began composing a new entry in the Orlith archives, their crystalline fingers hesitating over words they had never expected to write. "The galaxy has made a terrible mistake," they recorded. "We looked at humanity and saw children playing at civilization, and we did not understand what lay beneath their gentle smiles." They paused, searching for the right words to capture what they had witnessed. "They are not prey," Zeth Valamir finally wrote. "They are predators who chose to live as prey. And now they have remembered what they truly are." The observation drone continued recording as the human fleet pursued its fleeing enemy into the dark spaces between stars. Hunters who had tasted blood and would not rest until their hunt was complete. The Galactic Concord Assembly Station floated in neutral space like a jewel suspended in darkness, and within its vast chambers, representatives from 1,000 worlds gathered to discuss matters of trade and territory and the endless small conflicts that defined galactic civilization. Ambassador Do-Hyun Park stood near the back of the human delegation's viewing platform and watched the proceedings with the patience of a man who had spent 30 years learning to wait while others spoke over him. Humanity had been part of the Concord for 60 years now, ever since their first ships had stumbled into the territory of the Orlith Collective, and somehow managed not to start a war through sheer confused politeness. In those 6 decades, humans had earned a reputation as reliable traders and curious explorers, tough enough to survive their harsh homeworld, but technologically unremarkable compared to species that had traveled between stars for millennia. The elder races tolerated them the way one might tolerate an eager young worker who showed up early and stayed late but never quite understood the deeper politics of the office. Park had grown used to the condescension and the gentle dismissals and the way other ambassadors would look through him as if he were made of glass. He had learned to smile and nod and file away every Slight for future reference, because humans had long memories and patience that other species often mistook for weakness. Today, however, something had changed 3 days ago. The Vethrak Dominion had attacked the human colony world of New Bizan without warning or declaration of intent. The Vethrak were reptilian and massive and ancient, their empire stretching across 200 star systems, built on the bones of species they had conquered and absorbed over 10,000 years. They had decided that humanity was expanding too close to their claimed territories, and rather than negotiate or threaten or follow any of the established protocols of galactic diplomacy, they had simply attacked. The broadcasts had been sent across every Concord channel, and Park had watched them in his quarters with hands that would not stop shaking. He had seen cities burning and civilians running, and Vethrak soldiers laughing as they fired into crowds of unarmed colonists. He had seen schools destroyed and hospitals bombed and children crying for parents who would never come. 2,300,000 human beings had died in 72 hours, and the Vethrak had broadcast every moment as a warning to other lesser species who might consider expanding into territories they claimed as theirs. The Assembly had called an emergency session, and every species in the Concord had sent representatives to witness what they assumed would be humanity's surrender. Park looked across the chamber to where chronicler Zeth Valamir floated in their crystalline observation pod, light refracting through their silicon-based body as they recorded everything for the Great Oralith archives. The Oralith had been documenting galactic history for longer than most species had existed, and Zeth Valamir was one of their most respected chroniclers, present today to record what they surely believed would be humanity's epitaph. The Vethrak delegation occupied a massive platform near the center of the chamber, their scaled bodies gleaming under the artificial lights as they displayed the casual arrogance of predators who had never known defeat. Their lead ambassador, a scarred veteran named Krathsavonis, had been making jokes with nearby delegations about how quickly humans would beg for mercy. Park straightened his formal jacket and checked the datapad in his hand one final time before walking toward the central speaking platform. The chamber fell gradually silent as species noticed the human ambassador approaching the podium, whispers spreading like ripples through water as everyone prepared to witness the expected plea for protection. Krathsavonis leaned forward with amusement written across his scaled features, tongue flicking out to taste the air as if he could already savor the human's fear. Park reached the podium and looked out across the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. These ancient species who had watched humanity's emergence with polite disinterest for 60 years. He thought about New Bizan and families who never see their children grow up, and the dreams that had been burned to ash by Vethrak weapons. He thought about his own daughter, who had wanted to move to New Bizan next year to study marine biology in the colony's famous ocean research centers. He thought about what the elder races expected him to say and what they expected humanity to do, and how utterly completely wrong they all were. Distinguished representatives of the Galactic Concord, Park began, his voice steady and calm in a way that surprised even himself. I stand before you today not to plead for assistance or to beg for intervention in our conflict with the Vethrak Dominion. The chamber grew even quieter, confusion spreading across faces and forms that had never imagined hearing anything other than surrender from the young species. 3 days ago, the Vethrak Dominion committed an act of unprovoked aggression against the civilian population of New Bizan, resulting in the deaths of 2,300,000 human beings. Park paused and let the number hang in the air like smoke after a fire. We did not receive a declaration of war or a demand for territorial concession or any form of diplomatic communication prior to this attack, and the Vethrak have made clear through their own broadcasts that this massacre was intended as a message to humanity and to all species they consider beneath them. Kratsavonis was no longer smiling, something uncertain flickering behind his predator's eyes as he sensed that this was not going the way he had expected. Therefore, on behalf of the United Earth Government and all human colonies across known space, I am authorized to deliver the following message to the Vethrak Dominion and to the Galactic Concord as witness. Park lifted the datapad and read the words that would change everything. As of this moment, a state of total war exists between humanity and the Vethrak Dominion. And this state of war will continue until the Vethrak Dominion has been rendered incapable of threatening human lives or until humanity itself ceases to exist. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs and shocked exclamations as species tried to process what they had just heard. The Vethrak delegation burst into harsh, barking laughter. Kratsavonis slapping the platform railing as if Park had just told the funniest joke in galactic history. The little mammals think they can fight us. The Vethrak ambassador roared, his voice carrying across the chamber with predatory amusement. This will be entertaining for the few weeks it takes to exterminate them. Park waited for the noise to die down, his expression unchanged, his hands steady at his sides. Chronicler Zeth Valmer had stopped their recording and was now staring at the human ambassador with what might have been confusion, or concern, or perhaps the first stirrings of something that crystalline beings rarely felt. I have one final message, Park said, and something in his voice made even the laughing Vethrak grow quiet. Not to the Concord, but to the Dominion directly. He turned to face Kratsavonis, and for the first time, the Vethrak ambassador saw something in the human's eyes that made his scales prickle with an unfamiliar sensation. You have made a terrible mistake, Park said softly, his words carrying through the suddenly silent chamber with perfect clarity. You looked at us and saw a young species, weak and primitive and beneath your notice, and you thought you could slaughter our people without consequence. Park stepped down from the podium and began walking toward the exit, pausing only once to look back at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. You do not understand what you have awakened. And then he was gone, leaving behind a chamber full of ancient species who were only just beginning to realize that they had never truly known humanity at all. 3 months after Ambassador Park's declaration, the galaxy watched humanity with the casual interest of spectators observing a small animal challenge a much larger predator. Most species expected quiet negotiations to begin within weeks, perhaps a face-saving arrangement that would allow humans to claim they had defended their honor while the Vethrak absorbed whatever minor concessions were offered. The elder races had seen this pattern countless times across millennia of galactic history. Young species making bold declarations before reality taught them the cost of defying established powers. But humanity did not negotiate on Earth. The great industrial cities that had slumbered in peacetime efficiency suddenly roared to life with a fury that made the planet itself seem to shake. Factories that had produced consumer goods and luxury items converted to military production overnight, their workers volunteering for double shifts without complaint or demand for additional compensation. The Luna shipyards, which had been constructing a new generation of exploration vessels, scrapped every civilian project and began producing warships at a pace that should have been physically impossible. Dr. Minji Kang stood at the center of the Artemis Research Complex on the far side of Earth's moon and watched as her team of scientists abandoned decades of theoretical research to focus on a single goal. They called it Project Vengeance, though the official documents used more diplomatic terminology, and it involved taking every weapon humanity had ever created and making it work in the void between stars. Kang had spent her career studying peaceful applications of physics, dreaming of energy sources that could power human civilization for millennia. But now she channeled that same brilliant mind toward destruction. She did not sleep more than 4 hours each night, and neither did anyone else in her facility, because every hour of delay meant more human lives at risk across Earth's colonies. The story was the same. Sergeant Jaewon Lim had retired from military service 5 years ago, planning to spend his remaining decades farming the red soil of Mars and watching his grandchildren grow up under the dome of New Seoul City. When the news from New Bizen reached him, he walked to the nearest recruitment center and found a line of volunteers stretching around the block. Old soldiers like himself stood beside young people who had never held a weapon, beside teachers and doctors and artists and engineers, beside everyone who had seen the broadcasts and felt something ancient stir within their blood. The recruitment officer had tried to tell Lim that he was too old for frontline service, and Lim had responded by demonstrating hand-to-hand combat techniques that left the younger man gasping on the floor. He became the face of humanity's mobilization, his weathered features appearing on recruitment posters across every human world with a simple message beneath them. They think we are weak. Trade Minister Sara Huang coordinated the economic transformation from her office in Geneva, working with planetary governors and corporate leaders and labor unions to reshape human civilization into a single organism with a single purpose. She redirected food production to ensure soldiers would be fed, reorganized transportation networks to move military supplies efficiently, and convinced luxury industries to voluntarily convert their facilities rather than wait for government mandates. The humans did all of this without force or coercion, without the authoritarian measures that other species would have required to achieve such unity. They did it because they were angry, and because they were afraid, and because something deep within their genetic memory remembered what it meant to be hunted. Chronicler Zeth Valmer observed these developments from a neutral observation post in the Sol system, recording everything for the Orlith archives with growing unease. The crystalline being had documented the rise and fall of countless species across millions of years, and yet they had never witnessed anything quite like this. Other species went to war, certainly, with professional militaries and limited objectives and clear boundaries between combatants and civilians. But humanity seemed to have erased those boundaries entirely, transforming their entire civilization into a weapon pointed at the Vethrak Dominion. Zeth Valamir began researching human history, accessing old records that previous chroniclers had deemed unimportant. And what they discovered made their crystalline structure resonate with something that might have been fear. They found records of human conflicts that had consumed entire continents, wars that lasted for decades, battles that killed more of their own kind in a single day than many species lost in entire centuries. They discovered that humans had once built weapons capable of destroying their own world, bombs that split the fundamental building blocks of matter, and that they had used such weapons against each other. They learned about something called total war, a concept that did not exist in galactic culture. The idea that an entire species could mobilize for conflict without reservation or limit. The Vethrak Dominion continued to dismiss humanity's preparations as the desperate flailing of a doomed species. Krathsevonis sent regular reports to the Dominion High Command assuring them that the humans would exhaust themselves within months, that their primitive economy could not sustain prolonged military production, that their small population could not replace combat losses. The Dominion assembled their second fleet, a force of 300 warships crewed by veterans of a dozen successful conquests, and dispatched them to the Kepler system to crush the human resistance before it could become inconvenient. They expected to find scattered defenders, perhaps a few dozen human vessels making a symbolic last stand before the inevitable surrender. Instead, when their sensors swept the Kepler system, the Vethrak commander felt something cold settle into his stomach. There were human ships everywhere. Hundreds of vessels hung in formation, around Kepler 442b. Far more than should have existed. Far more than human industry should have been capable of producing in 3 months. And as the Vethrak fleet watched, those ships began to move, not retreating, not forming defensive positions, but advancing toward the Dominion forces with the coordinated precision of predators beginning their hunt. The Vethrak commander opened a channel to his fleet. All ships, prepare for combat, he ordered, and for the first time in his long career, his voice carried a note of uncertainty. He had conquered a dozen species across 50 years of service, had never known defeat, had never faced an enemy that did not eventually break and flee before Vethrak might. But something about those advancing human ships made his scales prickle with an ancient instinct that whispered warnings his conscious mind did not want to hear across the void. Admiral Uniseong stood on the bridge of the carrier, indomitable, and watched the Vethrak fleet through her tactical display. She had been a naval officer for 40 years, had commanded ships in skirmishes and patrol actions and the occasional pirate suppression. But she had never led a fleet into full-scale war. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. The knowledge that every order she gave would mean lives saved or lost, victories won or defeats suffered. But beneath that weight, burning like a star in her chest, was something far more powerful. She thought about New Bizen and the friends she had lost there and the children who would never grow up, and the message that humanity needed to send to the galaxy. All ships, she said, her voice calm and clear across every channel, weapons free, and humanity went to war.